Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. Today's episode in our series about historical counterfactuals is about a very specific what if. I'm going to be talking to the political and economic historian Benn Steil about what might have happened if, in 1944, Henry Wallace, and not Harry Truman, had been chosen as Franklin Roosevelt's running mate. A lot hangs on the answer. Apologies up front for the slightly tinny sound on Ben's audio in this episode. Do please stick with the conversation. It is really interesting. Ben, maybe we should start with an introduction to Henry Wallace for people who don't know a lot, perhaps don't know anything about who he was. And I thought maybe the place to start was in 1940. How did he get the vice presidential nomination? So Franklin Roosevelt picks him as his running mate in 1940. How did he get on the ticket, and what did he bring to the ticket?
Well, it's not well known that he was not, in fact, FDR's first choice. It wasn't even his second choice in 1940. FDR's first choice was Cordell Hull, his Secretary of State, a Tennessean who was well to the right of Wallace. Hull refused to take the position. At the time, in particular, it was a very low-profile position. As you know, it only had two constitutional responsibilities. One was to break tie votes in the Senate, and the other was to sit on presidential death watch. That would be an important role in 1944, but it wasn't yet in 1940. And in fact, the vice president only began sitting in the cabinet in 1924. So Hull was just completely uninterested in the position. Jimmy Burns was FDR's second choice, a South Carolinian, again, well to the right of Henry Wallace. And he was ultimately rejected for would seem today to be very esoteric religious reasons. He was born a Catholic, married a Protestant, and became a Protestant, and it was seen as an offense to Catholic voters. It was thought that he would lose millions of Catholic votes. So Wallace was the third choice. What did Wallace have that FDR liked? Well, we do know that FDR was absolutely insistent that whoever he ran with this time around, he had a very conservative Texas running mate his first two terms, John Nance Garner. Whoever he ran with this time around would have to be a committed internationalist. That is, FDR, as you know, was moving away from the New Deal focus of the first two terms towards engaging the United States in the world, because he could see the storm clouds coming. And Wallace certainly fit the bill on that count. He was seen as somebody who could help FDR secure the left flank of the Democratic Party, particularly since FDR, as I said, could no longer really afford to focus on the home front. He'd moved on from the New Deal. And Wallace was seen as somebody who would keep the flag flying. And finally, he was seen as somebody who would help in the farm states. Wallace was an Iowan. He had been agriculture secretary for FDR's first two terms, and he looked at least to FDR like a safe choice there. In the end, fast forward, FDR's Republican opponent, Wendell Willkie, only won 10 states in 1940, but 7 of them were in the Farm Belt, including Wallace's home state of Iowa. So in the end, Wallace was not a boon to the ticket in the farm states.
And I think it is true in American presidential history that sometimes you can overthink your vice presidential choice in electoral calculus terms, and it turns out it didn't work out, and the significance often lies in other areas, as we'll see it did in this case too. Wallace himself, he was an unusual man. I mean,
he was a very unusual man.
So I thought one way to characterize it is that not many politicians are scientists, and he genuinely was a scientist.
Yeah, absolutely.
At the same time, not many politicians are mystics, and he also was a bit of a mystic.
Not many scientists are mystics.
Just how would you characterize him as a politician, but also as a person? Because he's really unusual.
Yeah, a remarkably eclectic character. He came from what you might call Iowan agricultural aristocracy. His grandfather had founded what became a very influential farm journal in the country called Wallace's Farmer. And that was at the turn of the 20th century when around 40% of the U.S. population was involved in farming. So this is sort of like what a publication like Barron's would have been to the financial markets in the 1980s. This was a serious publication. Wallace himself was a remarkably accomplished agricultural geneticist, mostly self-taught. He conducted rather remarkable experiments on hybridization of crops, in particular corn, in the 1920s that ultimately proved to be extremely successful. The company he founded in the 1920s was sold to Monsanto in early 70s for over $9 billion. So most of the corn that we eat today was a product of Wallace's hybridization experiments. Even in his retirement, he was breeding chickens that would eat less and lay more eggs. So very accomplished. And FDR chose him as his first-term agriculture secretary, partly on the basis of his expertise, but also his father was agriculture secretary under Presidents Harding and Coolidge. So he seemed like a natural choice. As you know from reading the book, he was no natural politician. But as agriculture secretary at a time when FDR was absolutely determined to pursue radical solutions to what was becoming a Great Depression, Wallace seemed like a logical choice.
And the mysticism, how do you square it? How do you square the mysticism with the science?
Yeah, really remarkable in that, as I said, you rarely see science and mysticism mixed together. People are usually drawn to one or the other, not both. I mean, the unifying feature is Wallace was always looking for what you could characterize as new, novel ways of knowing, of understanding the world. And his attraction to mysticism derived from just his utter fascination with how the universe operated, and recognizing that sometimes you couldn't actually perform experiments. He was a devotee of the American psychologist philosopher William James, who controversially had argued that it is often logical, rational to believe without evidence, because in some cases we can't actually get evidence until we actually behave as if we believe. And you see that aspect of Wallace's thinking pervading his politics, particularly as we get into the 1940s. That is, Wallace believed that if he and the American people truly believed in peace, and in particular peace with the Soviet Union, that the Soviets would feel that truthfulness, that sincerity, and peace would naturally come about. So as you know, in the late 1920s, he became a devotee of a Russian mystic named Nicholas Roerich. He was already a major persona in the arts world in New York City. And after Wallace became agriculture secretary, he appointed Roerich, who again was an artist and a mystic. He was not a scientist, but he appointed Roerich to lead an agricultural expedition in Central Asia, 34 and 35, in theory, to find drought-resistant seeds that could aid the Dust Bowl Midwest. But in fact, that was a cover for Roerich's mission, which was to recreate the legendary Shambhala in Central Asia. He was going to create a new theocratic state, taking territory from Siberia, from Mongolia, from China. Remarkable story. And Wallace basically misled Congress, misled FDR, and did not pull back from this expedition until he almost caused a major diplomatic crisis in the region. The Soviets were very anxious about what Roerich was up to. The Japanese were anxious, and a series of damning articles were written in late spring of 1934 that caused Wallace to abandon the mission and claim that he knew nothing about what Roerich was up to. But his letters to Roerich, which became known as the Guru Letters, came back at many points in Wallace's career to almost undermine it entirely.
And yet this is the man in 1940 who is chosen to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. At the convention in 1940, he more or less had to be imposed on the party, didn't he? So you described the fact that it was a pretty humiliating experience, actually, his nomination, because he wanted to make a speech accepting the nomination, and he was told not even to get on the stage because he would be booed off it.
Yeah. Now, well, of course, we're used to today the tradition of a president choosing his running mate, but that's not actually enshrined anywhere. And in 1940, FDR was not an official candidate. FDR insisted that he would have to be drafted. He would only run if he were drafted, if he were nominated. And even then, only if there were no more than 150 votes against him on the first ballot. And after that, he insisted that he still would not run if he didn't get his choice for vice president. He felt that John Nance Garner, the Texan, had been someone who had been forced on him in 1932 because, he had to appease the Southern Democrats, but he wasn't going to do that anymore. And Wallace was a very controversial figure within the party. Southerners in particular saw him as being too liberal, saw him as the defender of some of the more controversial aspects of the New Deal, particularly in agriculture. Wallace, for example, was responsible for the premature slaughter of 6 million hogs as a way to raise agricultural prices. It was a very controversial and not particularly logical way of doing it. And of course, he was seen as a bit of a flake and a mystic. And so FDR had his hands full trying to jam this through the convention. And as you said, he expected to make an acceptance speech when he ultimately got the nomination. And Jimmy Burns, who was the convention manager, wouldn't let Wallace go up and make the speech because he didn't want the winner booed down.
And yet we get this extraordinary turnaround. So if we then fast forward to 1944, which is this often seen as a hinge of American history, and the convention itself, you can almost, it's one of those great counterfactuals, you can almost take it down to a minute-by-minute story. But the big turnaround here is that by the time we get to 1944, FDR and more particularly the bigwigs in the party want Wallace off the ticket. But the convention, he's become their darling, this version of the Democratic Party that convenes in Chicago. It's Chicago, isn't it? It always seems to be Chicago. These conventions in Chicago is quite close to nominating him by acclamation. So how do we get from a convention in 1940 where he's not allowed even on stage because the conventioneers will drown him out, to 1944 where if there's a floor vote, at least on the first evening, there looks like a chance that against the wishes of the party establishment, the delegates will nominate Wallace? How would he become their darling?
Less is changed than meets the eye. I start the book out with this scene of pandemonium in the convention with what appear to be the delegates shouting, "We want Wallace, we want Wallace." And it looks like he's going to be nominated by acclamation. Later in the book, when I actually go through the convention in detail, what I show is that this was not the will of the delegates. These were not primarily the delegates that were calling for him. There were only 1,176 delegates. There were 35,000 people in a hall with a maximum capacity of 19,000. And the evidence, such as it is, we don't have a complete story of what went on, is that the American Labor Organization, the CIO, had managed to secure many thousands of tickets, which they distributed to their supporters with instructions to support Wallace. These tickets had been date and time stamped. That you would be allowed into the convention at a certain time, but they weren't color coded. And there was really a stampede into the convention in Chicago. So the overwhelming majority of these people who were calling for Wallace's nomination were from the peanut gallery, as it were. They were not delegates.
Yet that word stampede is the one that I associate with conventions in American history that can be decisive. One of the things that you try and engineer in the convention hall is what was known as a stampede. It was thought to be a highly volatile, emotional form of politics. So the question here, I'm going to ask you in a second about how much was known about FDR's health. But Roosevelt and the party establishment had decided by a roundabout route, having gone through the alternatives, that they were going to go for Harry Truman. And so it was Truman versus Wallace at this point. How close did Wallace get, do you think, to winning the nomination? So it might look like the "we want Wallace" moment is a little inflated historically, and a lot of people have put a lot of weight on it. Nonetheless, these occasions are not entirely predictable. And you describe, a sort of contest to get on stage, a bit like, they try to keep him off stage in 1940. A senator, Senator Pepper, one of his supporters, tried to get on stage to call for a vote. And there was some thought that the people running the convention had lost control of the convention. Is it possible? I mean, is it really conceivable that Wallace could have been forced on FDR by the convention?
This is a great question. And the legend, which was greatly fueled by one of Oliver Stone's quote-unquote documentaries in 2012, a film called The Untold History of the United States, is that if Pepper had been successful in getting a vote on the floor that evening on July 20th, 1944, Wallace would have been elected. Instead, what happened was, just as Pepper arrives at the podium about to make the nomination, the convention manager, Chairman Samuel Jackson, raps the podium and says, "Convention adjourned," until the next day. And the legend is that overnight, from July 20th to the 21st, the party leaders used bribery, in essence, to convince the delegation chairman to give their votes to Truman. So several problems with this storyline. First of all, imagine, David, that you were a delegate at the time, and you weren't quite sure how you were going to vote. Just you're an open-minded delegate. And you see what's going on in the crowd. You see these people in the peanut gallery screaming, "We want Wallace," rushing onto the floor, grabbing the state's banners, in some cases pushing the delegates out of their seats. Is this going to enamor you to their candidate, or is this going to push you away from their candidate? And I wondered about this because the legend is that it's a stampede for Wallace. They're all going to vote for Wallace. But I thought, hey, if I'm a delegate, this is not going to appeal to me. And indeed, I went through all the newspaper reports from the floor, and the New York Times floor reporter said that the delegates that he spoke to were extremely angry about what was going on. It's not clear that Wallace would have won. And in fact, the man who became Wallace's presidential campaign manager in 1948, a man named Beanie Baldwin, in an oral history in 1951, said indeed that Wallace did much better because the vote was held the next day, because in fact the delegates were angry. So, this legend that was particularly fueled by Oliver Stone, I think is wrong.
Is it also the case, the difference in 1940, Roosevelt was effectively able to say, if you want me, you get my choice of running mate. In 44, Roosevelt was going to be the presidential nominee. It was a very dangerous time in the history of the world. But at the same time, with hindsight, of course, we know what happened, which is effectively they were choosing the next president. And obviously this has some relevance to what we've been through already this summer in relation to Biden. And had Biden still to be the candidate, and were we coming up to another Democratic Party convention in Chicago, this question would have been acute again, which is, endorsing this vice presidential candidate, are we also, in theory, picking the next president? So we know within a year, whether it was Truman or Wallace, that person would have become president. How widely was that understood at the time? What knowledge was there, for instance, of FDR's health? We know everything about Biden's health now because we see it, but people didn't see it, right?
It's a great question. Yeah, I had written a piece in Time back in February when Biden certainly looked like he was the nominee, arguing, hey, this is the most important vice presidential choice since Wallace and Truman in 1944, because just actuarially, Biden, if he were reelected, had only a 1/3 chance of surviving another term. And so there was a significant possibility that the vice president would become the president. So do we need a more open process? Now, in 1944, the condition of the president's health was much more tightly held. He only had a first heart evaluation in March by a young cardiologist named Bruin. And Bruin never told FDR his diagnosis, and FDR never asked. But he was diagnosed with advanced congestive heart failure. Now, the DNC leaders, who were absolutely unanimous in pushing FDR to take another vice president, never knew the diagnosis, but they could see in FDR's face that he was deteriorating rapidly. When he would go to light a cigarette, his hand would shake. So it was quite clear to them visibly that whatever the president's problems, he was not going to survive a fourth term, which why it was much more important to them than it had been in 1940 that the vice president be someone else other than Henry Wallace.
And how did they alight on Truman? Not particularly well known, someone onto whom people could project different things because he wasn't associated with a particular wing of the party. He was more associated with where he'd come from, right? He was thought to be a particular kind of machine politician. Was it machine politician versus flaky mystic? Was it machine politician versus unreliable, too liberal leftist? How did they see the choice? Not necessarily FDR himself, but the people effectively running the party.
There were half a dozen men among the DNC leadership who were very influential with FDR, who pushed for Truman. The DNC chairman, Bob Hannigan, was from St. Louis, and he was absolutely instrumental to Truman's rise into the Senate and then becoming an important member of the Senate in the 1940s. We look back at him today, and, there's this legend that somehow he came from nowhere. He's completely unaccomplished. But that's not actually completely fair. He had been chairman of the so-called Truman Commission in 1943 that looked at waste and corruption in government spending and procurement during the war. And he was credited with saving the U.S. government the equivalent in today's money of hundreds of billions of dollars during the war. I mean, he was on the cover of Time. He was not an inconsequential senator. Now, Bob Hannigan, the DNC chairman, was Truman's biggest booster. But I should emphasize that Hannigan was always a good servant of the president. And if the president had decided to go in another direction, at least a responsible direction as he saw it, there were other candidates, Jimmy Burns. And the evidence is pretty strong that FDR would have been very happy to run with Jimmy Burns. Hannigan would have bought into that. But Truman had a number of aspects to his political persona that made him a logical choice. He was from a border state, from Missouri, so he was considered to be in the South, but not of the South. He had, for example, he was considered acceptable to Southerners, but he had good relations with labor leaders and civil rights leaders. So he was someone who could appeal to all the different major constituencies within the party. He was seen as somebody who was level-headed and moderate. That is, he was a committed New Dealer, but he was not seen as being over the top in the way that Wallace was. And he was seen very important as somebody who would be stolid on foreign policy. By the time we get to 1944, there's huge concern within the Democratic Party about Wallace's views on the Soviet Union. He'd made all these speeches praising quote-unquote economic democracy in the Soviet Union. He had just before the Democratic Convention spent 4 weeks on an NKVD guided tour of Siberia. So, this man was seen as being out there, whereas Truman was seen as somebody who, if he had to step in to FDR's shoes, would do a responsible job.
And the other thing that we know with hindsight, but as you suggested there, was also at least intuited at the time, which is, were FDR's vice president to have to step into his shoes in 1945, the new president would be facing an extraordinary range of enormously consequential decisions. So in the summer of 44, no one knew how the war would end. No one knew would it have ended. Some hope it would end by the end of 44. No one knew where we were, the war in Europe, the war in the Pacific. But the choices that Truman did have to face in April 1945 and beyond, including the use of atomic weapons, how to deal with Stalin, as the war ends in Europe, how Europe is going to be divided, what's going to happen to Germany, what's going to happen in Berlin, all of these questions. Truman faced a remarkable array of challenges in, the whole of his first term, but particularly early on. So it does look like a fork in the road, as you describe it. Here's this day at the Democratic Party convention in Chicago, which could conceivably have resulted in Henry Wallace retaining the vice presidential nomination.
As you know, he was leading on the first ballot. So, the DNC leaders felt like they had it under control, but they were not entirely sure.
Yeah. And presumably, as I suggested, had the convention nominated Wallace, FDR would have acquiesced. He could have once again said, well, if I don't get Truman, you don't get me. But it seems, to me, different from 1940.
No, he did not. He actually made it clear to the hall in the sense that he made anything clear. It was ridiculous how he handled 44. He actually endorsed 4 separate candidates in 4 separate ways. But he did make clear to the convention that he would not impose on the convention. He said, I couldn't do that. Of course, in 1940, he absolutely did. He said, you give me my choice of running mate or I'm out. In this particular case, he played the humble card, said, I like Henry Wallace. If I were a delegate, I'd vote for Henry Wallace, but I'm not a delegate, and I'm sure you will make a wise choice. And that was widely understood as a diplomatic way of saying, Henry's out. So the question is, who would emerge? And the party leaders, despite Oliver Stone's claims that they bribed delegates, they were not bribed. The party bigwigs lobbied hard among the chairman of the delegations to make clear that the president's choice was, in fact, Harry Truman.
So as you say, the message was Henry's out, but the message wasn't, if you foist Henry on me, I'm out. So it is at least conceivable. And then you get the other half of the Oliver Stone equation, and it's not just Oliver Stone, which is you get a very different second half of the 20th century, or at least...
Oh, Lord, yes.
So that's the counterfactual here. So I want to explore it a little bit, and then I want to come back to what actually happened. But the suggestion is, at least from some people, that a Wallace presidency, Wallace would have been very wary of using nuclear weapons. Wallace's view was this terrible weapon had to be under international control. Wallace was sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Depending on your perspective, he was either going to achieve a peaceful form of cooperation with the Soviet Union, or he would have been a complete pushover and allowed Stalin simply to sort of walk through whichever parts of Europe, including Western Europe, he wanted. It does look very, very different. But one of my questions is, it's easy to extrapolate in these counterfactuals. Here's Henry Wallace. These are the things he believed in. These were some of the things he was going to go on and say later in the 1940s when he runs as a third-party candidate in 1948. But could he have actually, given, as you said, he wasn't a natural politician, could he, even as president of the United States, turned around the ship of state, which was pointing in a particular direction, and face down the American foreign policy establishment? Because that seems to me a little overblown in some of these counterfactuals.
The first point I want to make is that although Wallace has traditionally been called a pacifist, that's too simplistic. He was overwhelmingly in favor of quote-unquote peace with the Soviet Union, but he was not a pacifist. He was a member of the so-called Top Policy Group that was a precursor to the Manhattan Project. He advised Roosevelt to pursue atomic weapons. He never, ever expressed the slightest criticism of Truman for dropping the atom bomb on Japan twice. There's virtually nothing in his diary about it. During the war, he never expressed the slightest concern about the fate of Japanese or German civilians in the war. So there's no reason to believe that Wallace wouldn't have dropped the bomb, just like Truman did. I spend a lot of time in the book talking about nuclear politics, particularly in 1946, when Wallace's primary advisor, when he becomes Commerce Secretary, first under FDR and then under Truman, Wallace's primary advisor, Harry Magdoff, is a Soviet agent. And Wallace winds up producing all these insane position papers that basically mimic the Soviet position on nuclear arms, which is that the United States should unilaterally dismantle all its weapons, but that the Soviet Union should never be required to submit to international tests because that would be a violation of its sovereignty. So, Wallace took his position basically from Pravda. I show his position was almost identical to a major article in Pravda. Now, as to your big question, could Wallace have prevented the Cold War bringing on board the whole political establishment in Washington? I would answer this way. He could not have, in my view, committed sins of commission. They would have been sins of omission. In other words, a number of the initiatives that he strongly backed could never have gotten legislative support. For example, he opposed the Marshall Plan after Stalin did and wanted to replace it with a UN-run program over 4 times the size of the Marshall Plan. So this would have been $50 billion, about $650 billion in current money, to be controlled entirely by the United Nations, with the funds primarily directed to those who suffered the most damage from Nazi Germany. So this would have meant the equivalent of, in today's money, hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money going to the Soviet Union. There is no way in hell that this could ever have passed through Congress. So, of course, an aspect of Wallace's program like that would have been dead on arrival. Having said that, there were many unilateral actions that Harry Truman took, for example, in 1946, without consulting Congress. For example, sending a large military flotilla to the Mediterranean to deter Stalin, who had put 300,000 troops on the border with Turkey and had refused to withdraw Soviet troops from northern Iran. He was fueling a separatist movement in northern Iran. And Truman made absolutely clear that the United States would never accept Soviet encroachment into Turkish or Iranian sovereign territory. And Stalin got the message, and he backed off. And he backed off in Greece as well. And it's quite clear that Wallace would never have done this, would never have sent a flotilla to the region. Wallace, throughout 1945 and into 1946, was defending staunchly the Soviet rampage through Manchuria. Over 1 million Soviet troops were in Manchuria, raping, pillaging, ripping up factories and transporting them back to the Soviet Union. Truman was unable to stop this, but managed to bring it to an earlier end than would have been the case under President Wallace. So what I would say is this, that the Cold War would certainly have started, but it would not have started under Wallace's watch. He would have done everything possible to argue that it was unnecessary and that the Soviets had reasonable security concerns and all these problems could be worked out. But he would have lost the election in 1948 to Thomas Dewey, who would have picked up the torch of the Cold War. But what I would argue is that by that time, the U.S. would have been fighting the Cold War at a major strategic disadvantage. By that time, I believe the Soviets would have come to control eastern Turkey, the Turkish Straits, northern Iran, the Korean Peninsula, the entirety of the Korean Peninsula, Hokkaido, and of course, Greece, I think you could add to the equation. And most importantly, the grand prize, Germany. Wallace was staunchly against the division of Germany and would almost certainly have acquiesced in a unification of the country under what it would have effectively been pro-Soviet leadership.
Is it possible to distinguish in this? It seems to me there are three things that are going on here, one of which is some of this is what Wallace believed. He had a set of convictions that cut across his political career. Some of this is reading off the oppositional positions he took after he'd been overlooked for Truman, and then after Truman becomes president, and then eventually Wallace resigns as Commerce Secretary and is on his way to running against Truman in 1948. So some of this is oppositional politics. He's on the outside of the Democratic Party establishment. And then some of it, as you say, is being fed to him from Moscow. So you've got three things going on here, which make it, to me, quite hard to know what kind of a president he would have been. He would have been a very different president from Harry Truman. It would have been a very different world. But some of it is overblown in reading all of those three things as though that would be the shape of his presidency, because presumably being president changes people. He would have been working inside the heart of the power establishment in Washington, D.C. He was also to the left or more liberal than both Roosevelt and Truman on domestic matters as well. So is there another possibility here? Truman's presidency was very much defined by foreign policy. Is there a possibility that some deal might have been done where Wallace is given his head more on domestic matters, so he's got to get a lot of that through Congress, and he cedes some of this to the establishment? And so you might get a different domestic politics in the US over that one term. I agree with you. He'd never been elected to anything in his own right. You know, he was only vice president because of FDR. The idea that he would have won in 1948 seems to me very unlikely. So we're talking about a one-term presidency. He's not a vote winner in his own right, but you can do a lot in 4 years. Could there have been a significant shift domestically with a Wallace presidency, do you think? Because he was quite far to the left at that point.
I agree. But the reason I don't believe that's the case is by the early 1940s, when Wallace becomes vice president, he's really lost interest in domestic policy. As I said, he had just been agriculture secretary for 2 terms. For better or for worse, he revolutionized agricultural policy in the United States. He presided over transfers equivalent to $1.2 trillion in today's money to the Farm Belt. Yet he was extremely unpopular in the Farm Belt. In 1948, when he ran for president, he got barely 1% of the vote in Iowa, his home state. So as vice president, his primary responsibility given to him by Roosevelt was war procurement. Okay, he was not dealing with domestic policy. And as Commerce Secretary in 45 and 46, he should have been dealing with domestic policy. Truman would have loved to have been able to get rid of him, but he saw Wallace in the same way FDR did, as somebody you needed to keep inside the tent pissing out rather than outside the tent pissing in. He had to protect his left flank. But Truman was furious that Wallace was in a domestic policy position, but was doing nothing but undermining his foreign policy. So there's really just no evidence that Wallace had any great interest in domestic policy at this point. Some people would point to the fact that Wallace took courageous positions on civil rights. And he did. But there were rhetorical positions. For example, on the campaign trail, in 1948, when he ran for president, he spent a week touring through the South condemning segregation. It was very bold, but he never had a legislative agenda. And when he was a cabinet minister, he was criticized by civil rights leaders for never having done anything to desegregate his department, unlike other members of the Roosevelt administration, like Henry Morgenthau, who was, well to the right of Wallace. So, that's my pushback there, that by the time we get to 45, 46, Wallace has completely lost interest in domestic policy. His big theme is peace with the Soviet Union because it is necessary to peace in the world.
He lasted 18 months or so as Commerce Secretary, but eventually Truman, notwithstanding the fact that he was there to protect his left flank, couldn't tolerate him anymore. How did it finally break down? What was the breaking point?
September in 46, Wallace does two things. He makes a speech before a Soviet-friendly crowd at Madison Square Garden, completely undermining Truman's foreign policy, basically condemning it, saying it's unnecessarily hostile to the Soviet Union. At the same time, Truman's Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, was in Europe trying to conclude peace agreements with the former Axis countries. And we're in the midst of very delicate negotiations with the Soviets that aren't going well. And Wallace is undermining this constantly with public statement. Second, he had produced a very long letter to Truman in July of 1946 that was even more extreme than his Madison Square Garden speech. And we know why today, because it was written by Harry Magdoff, his advisor, who was a Soviet agent, absolutely condemning U.S. policy, particularly on atomic weapons. This leaked. We don't know from where it leaked. It probably came from the State Department on the right. And at that point, Truman just concluded there's no way to control this man. I would much rather have him protecting my left flank. He's doing more damage than good for the party, and set him loose, forced him to resign, essentially. But there was plenty of evidence that Wallace was planning to resign and run against Truman. His first choice was to run against Truman as a Democrat, to challenge him within the party. It was only when he realized that he had no prospect of unseating Truman within the party that he agreed to run as a candidate of a new progressive party in 1948.
With the support of the Communist Party of America.
Yeah, this is a rather remarkable story. The Progressive Party really split the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. After Wallace did this, you had a sort of right wing of the liberal movement and a left wing. The right wing, of course, stayed in the Democratic Party. These became people like Eleanor Roosevelt, who had been a staunch supporter of Wallace in 44 and was very angry that her husband had pushed him off the ticket. Arthur Schlesinger, all these legends of the Democratic Party of the second half of the 20th century. But a lot of hardcore progressives went with Wallace. Now, the tragedy of the Progressive Party is that although there were genuine liberals within the movement, the apparatus of the party itself was completely taken over by the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States. They controlled the party convention, for example, in 1948, which produced all sorts of ridiculous resolutions, which were virtually identical to the CPUSA's position. And they were using Wallace as a way to grab power and then, in their belief, of course, move the United States towards communism. It didn't work out the way they envisioned. But as I explain in the book, that Wallace's conversion, which begins in 1950 with the Korean War, where he comes out, he leaves the Progressive Party, he condemns the Soviet Union, in my view, was driven very much by personal considerations that after his thumping in the 1948 election, he gets barely 2% of the vote. He actually comes in fourth, not third, behind Dixiecrat segregationist Strom Thurmond. He is absolutely bitter towards the communists, American communists and Soviet communists, who he thinks let him down. That he finally becomes convinced that the American communists had been using him. And once he lost the election as badly as he did, the Soviets didn't want to deal with him anymore. Stalin actually produced a directive to the Politburo, which said, let Wallace screw around as he pleases. We are not to have any contact with him anymore. He was absolutely useless to the Soviets at this point because he was a nobody again. In Washington, the Truman administration wouldn't talk to him. He had tried to reinvent himself as a mediator between Washington and Moscow, but neither party would talk to him. And he was a bitter man. And he was looking for revenge against the people who he felt let him down.
Would you describe him as a narcissist? Reading about him, there are moments when it just seems like he's so wrapped up in his sense of himself, some of it pretty weird, to be honest. It's not like he's a secret communist or a secret this or a secret that. He's like a holy fool, but also a narcissist at various points and easily manipulable.
Yeah, he has a certain messiah complex that constantly comes through. He constantly, as you see, changes his position on specific policy issues. For example, when Stalin turns against something, Wallace would turn against it because he's trying to keep himself meaningful in Moscow. But he was, as you can imagine, he was constantly painted in the late 1940s by the American press as a flip-flopper. He kept changing his positions on major subjects, like, for example, the Marshall Plan, which he was initially for until Stalin came out against it. But this never bothered Wallace because he always left policy details to surrogates. They weren't important. The important thing was Henry Wallace, who was a man who was clearly dedicated to his core to world peace, to the century of the common man, as he called it. And, I liken it in the book to a righteous man who changes his clothes every day. He doesn't become less righteous because he changes his clothes. That's just something he has to do from time to time. He doesn't become less righteous because he changes his clothes. His righteousness is an intrinsic part of who he is. And that's how Wallace sees himself. Specific policy positions, that can be left to subordinates. Those aren't terribly important. The big problem, as I say, is Wallace was a very bad judge of character. And many of the people that he allowed to write his policy positions were Soviet agents like Harry Magdoff, or Soviet assets. That is, they weren't formally reporting to Moscow like Magdoff was, but they were extremely sympathetic to the Soviet line. And Wallace would take support from whence it came. He did not care. As long as people were, as he saw it, loyal to him, he welcomed their support.
Two last questions. One about the election in 1948. So as you say, it was a flop. The progressive candidacy of Henry Wallace was a flop. But nonetheless, this was an election notoriously that Truman was expected to lose right up until the night of the election itself and a bit beyond, the celebrated newspaper headline. He took some votes from the left of the Democratic Party. Why did he not, if he split that wing of the party, divided parties tend to lose elections and Truman was already in trouble, why did he not do more harm to Truman's candidacy?
This is a great question. Of course, Truman expected that Wallace would do him harm and take votes. But in the end, Wallace may actually have done Truman a favor by making him look more moderate and in some cases more conservative than he was. Of course, Dewey wanted to paint Truman as being a man of the left, not willing to stand up for America. Wallace made that harder to do. And the Democrats really understood that. I give the example of Wallace's literal collusion with Stalin in spring of 1948, where he's passing back and forth documents to Moscow through Gromyko. He's trying to negotiate a combined statement with Stalin. And I actually have Stalin's handwritten edits on Wallace's supposed open letter to Generalissimo Stalin. This was largely written by Stalin himself. So Wallace makes a passionate pro-Soviet speech, painting himself as the only man who can bring the two countries to peace. On May 11, 1948, the State Department suspects that Wallace is in secret contacts with the Kremlin at the highest level. So they go to the FBI. The FBI embeds an agent in the print shop that Wallace used to print up his speech and determines that given the timing of the arrival of Wallace's speech at the print shop, that he had to have known material that was non-public at the time from Moscow, because it was only revealed later on Moscow radio. So if the Truman administration had wanted to prosecute Wallace, for example, under the 1799 Logan Act, they could have. It's probably the strongest case in American history where they could have used the Logan Act, but they decided not to. And the reason was that the more this stuff would come out about how close Wallace was to the Soviets, the further he would sink in the polls. And if you look at the Gallup polls from the time, the American public is more staunchly anti-Soviet than is reflected in Truman's policies. The American public is really going to the right on foreign policy. So the Truman administration says, hey, this guy is good for us. I mean, he's making us look strong. He's making us look reasonable. Let him hang it himself. And so there's no doubt Wallace did take some votes from Truman, but he may also have brought him votes in making him look like a stronger leader than he would have in the absence of Wallace's candidacy. Also, I would point out that although he got 1.15 million votes in the end, 37% of those votes came from New York City alone. So this was not, a particularly important constituency from which Wallace was taking votes. So in the end, he did less damage to Truman than Truman had feared that he would do.
So the last question is really about the counterfactual. What's so fascinating about it is that it is tantalizing. It's one of those rare moments where you feel like, you describe in the book that Pepper's trying to get to the stage and there's like a gate which has to be opened. And you sort of think, well, what if there hadn't been a gate or the gate had been on the other side? The best counterfactuals turn on tiny accidents of geography, the layout of the room. And yet it can be overblown. And I think you've suggested that the sort of Oliver Stone version, but also maybe some of the other versions too, including versions on the right, this would have been the end of America and all of that. It would have been a one-term presidency. Many things would have been different, but in the long run, much might have been the same. In some ways, to me, the most remarkable feature of the story is just how close a man like this came to be president of the United States, because he is such an unusual politician. It's not unusual for a politician to be a narcissist. It's not unusual for a politician to have bad judgment about human nature. You can be president and have those qualities. We can think of one or two contemporary examples. But he was a very, very unusual political figure. And in many ways, a very successful politician. As you said, he'd been, in his way, a very successful Secretary of Agriculture. He'd had a term as Vice President of the United States at an incredibly dangerous moment in the history of the world. When you look at him with that counterfactual in mind, what is your assessment of Henry Wallace, the politician, and his significance for American history?
Well, he could never have been elected to high office in his own right. I don't want to play medical professional here, but he has many of the characteristics which we associate today with something called Asperger's syndrome. He was exceptionally intelligent, exceptionally detail-oriented, but that intelligence mostly applied to inanimate objects. He was very bad at judging people, evaluating their agendas, detecting duplicity. He didn't like social situations. He hated campaigning. Absolutely hated it, didn't want to have anything to do with it. In 1944, he didn't even want to come to the convention to advocate for himself. He had to be convinced to do it. So he could only have gotten to that level as somebody who had been brought along by a great politician like FDR, who made him agriculture secretary and then took him on against the will of the party as his running mate. But given the mechanics of the American political system, he came very close to the pinnacle of world power, not just to the presidency of the United States, but the presidency of the United States at a time when America was at the apex of its political, economic, and military power in the world. So it really is a remarkable ascent to power. that was cut off at certain critical moments by factors that seem so frivolous now today, like Claude Pepper's dash for the stage at the convention. But I think that really just reinforces the understanding that we need, that people really matter, that we're not just flotsam on the seas of historical forces. People, what they do, what they say, what they think at critical moments in history really do make a difference. And so I agree with you that there were limits to what Wallace could have done had he become president. He would not have been dictator, but I do think it would be a quite different world that we would be living in today. I think we were fortunate to have Harry Truman in that position at that time under those circumstances.
I've asked you the last question, but one very last one. And when you think about it in 2024, because we're living through an extremely contingent year in American politics, not just a vital year that, elections are always sold to us as the most important election ever. And maybe this one is, you never know. You need hindsight to know that. But what this one does feel like is that it is turning, the story of this year so far is turning on these incidental aspects of human personality, mortality, the trajectory of bullets. It feels like a year in which, in some ways, the lessons of 44 are acute.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I think we may well be, next year when we start talking about this election, maybe highlighting all this, serendipity, as it were. But, let us say that Harris does win the election. So much of that will have hinged on Joe Biden's very late decision to pull out. Because, it seems pretty clear at this point that he wasn't going to win the election. And as you know, the gap between the two parties, and in particular between the two candidates, is enormous. So we're really talking about the prospect of taking the country into two very, very different directions. And so much of it hinged on things that were, very much within the control of certain individuals. In one case, a kid almost, who fired a bullet at Donald Trump, which just barely missed killing him. In another case, a president of the United States who I think really genuinely didn't realize the extent to which he was declining physically, cognitively, but made a decision that could really change the trajectory of American and possibly world history.
If you'd like to read more about Henry Wallace, I do really recommend Benn Steil's book. It is called The World That Wasn't, Henry Wallace and the Fate of the American Century. If you would like to sign up to PPF Plus, where you will get 24 bonus episodes a year and ad-free listening, just go to ppfideas.com, which you will also discover is now our brand new website. And there you'll find everything connected with this podcast. All of our episodes, all of our newsletters, information about our different series, and information about all of our bonus episodes. There will be a new one coming soon. Next time, we're also going to be telling you about what we will be doing for the last couple of weeks of August. But before that, one more what if in this part of our political counterfactuals series. I'm going to be talking to Thant Mint Oo about what might have happened if the Vietnam War had ended in 1964. It was possible, and again, it might have created a very different world. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.